All right, everyone, I hope you have your paper and your pencil ready to go because we have a lecture to do. So let's get started. We're going to start with the focus questions. First, under whose reign did the period of prosperity and peace begin? And your answer for that is under Caesar Augustus. And next, what civilization greatly influenced Rome? That would be the civilization we learned about in the last chapter, which is Greece. All right, just to let you know, Caesar Augustus is actually in the Bible, and this is Luke chapter 2, verse 1, and it came to pass in those days that a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. So Jesus was born when Caesar Augustus was the ruler of Rome. All right, let's talk about the Pax Romana. In what ways did Octavian, who eventually became known as Caesar Augustus, change the government? He worked to restore honesty, diligence, and respect to the government. Because remember, we talked about how the voters had become lazy and they just let the government do whatever they wanted, and the people wanted whatever was best for them. They didn't care what happened in the government. So Octavian / Augustus Caesar worked to change that. He restored power to the Senate and to the tribal assembly. He reorganized the army and the government of the Roman territories, and he made himself tribune, which then ultimately became emperor. All right. During this time period, Octavian promoted trade, he promoted industry, and he also encouraged building roads. This period in Roman history is called the Pax Romana, which in Latin means Roman peace, and it extended from 31 BC all the way to 180 AD. So over 200 years this peace of Rome lasted. So Pax Romana means Roman peace, and you need to know those dates there, 31 BC to 180 AD. And the Pax Romana ended with the death of Caesar Marcus Aurelius. During this era, both boys and girls got an education. The father was responsible for the education of the children. During the Pax Romana, fathers were responsible for their children's education. During the Pax Romana, fathers were responsible for their children's education. During this time, children from wealthy families would have a tutor or a student teach them, but both boys and girls got to go to school during this time period. Students were taught Greek, Latin, history, geography, astronomy, and literature. At age 16, a boy would become a Roman citizen, and there was a special citizenship ceremony that was held in the Forum of Rome, and from that time on, a boy was allowed to wear a toga. Important people who lived during this time, first we have Cicero, and he was a great orator or a speaker. He mastered Latin prose, which is the type of reading that you would be normally used to reading. This is not poetry, it's the opposite of that. He was the greatest orator or public speaker of his day. He was also a philosopher, a lawyer, and a senator. A couple of important authors who were alive during this time, make sure you write down what they wrote. We have Virgil, and he wrote the Aeneid, which was an epic about Rome's glory. It starts with the fall of Troy, and Aeneas goes to Rome and basically starts the city and helps it to become great. And Livy wrote a history of Rome, and he wrote about the time that he was living in. So if he's writing about the time that he lived in, that would mean he was writing a primary source. All right, quick little review here. During the Pax Romana, what was Rome similar to? This would be similar to the Golden Age of Greece. Remember, we learned about that in the last chapter. And how are Roman schools different from our schools today? Oh, lots of ways. They used scrolls instead of books. They had chairs without desks. There were fewer students per teacher. Obviously, there were some different subjects taught. We don't learn Greek and Latin regularly in our schools. And of course, they had different clothing that they wore. All right, let's talk about the culture in the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was most influenced by the Greek Empire. The Romans made contributions in law and politics, but Rome's greatest achievement was made in architecture and buildings, specifically the building material that the Romans used. The Romans developed concrete. Concrete was a mixture of gravel, sand, and mortar, and the advantages of using concrete were that it lowered building costs, and buildings that were made of concrete would be cheaper and more durable. They would last longer. So in order to make their buildings pretty, the Romans would make the inside part of the structure of concrete, but then they would cover it with a thin sheet of marble, so then it looked nice and white like the Greek buildings did, but it was more economical because it had concrete on the inside. A couple of really famous things that the Romans created, the architectural feature that they created was the dome. There's a picture of the Pantheon in your textbook that shows this dome, and it is still standing today. I got to go visit it once. Other famous buildings that they built were obviously the Colosseum. So we have the Pantheon and the Colosseum, two buildings that were built by the Romans that still exist today. Fun fact that you might want to write down: when I was 14, I got to visit both the Pantheon and the Colosseum in Rome. So when I was 14, write it down, I got to visit the Pantheon and the Colosseum. When I was 14, I went to Rome. All right, so some of the features of the Colosseum still amaze architects and engineers today. First of all, it was built in just 2 years without modern construction equipment like concrete mixers or cranes or any of those sorts of things. It is impressive and it's massive. It held nearly 50,000 people. This is similar to the stadiums that we have today. The College Stadium at the University of Central Florida holds about 45,000 people. Also, the Colosseum floor was made of wood, and they would cover it with sand, and sections of the floor could be raised or lowered, and there were elevators, and sometimes they would flood the Colosseum and have fake naval battles or naval battle reenactments. They also used it for chariot races, gladiator contests, and animal fights. So the Colosseum was the amphitheater to go visit back in the day. All right, how did the Romans and the Greeks differ in their purpose for building? The Romans, super practical. The Greeks wanted things to be beautiful and pleasing to look at. The reasons that emperors staged events at the Colosseum were to win public favor and to keep the people entertained, and because they wanted to stay in power. All right, let's wrap it up. Dig and drill. During what period did the Romans enjoy peace and prosperity? The Pax Romana. And last, what did Cicero introduce to the Romans? He introduced Greek philosophy to the Romans. All right, that's all for the lecture for this week.